Okay, so here we're going to talk about oil furnaces and boilers. Here we have an oil tank that's above ground. They also make them below ground. These are the most common though, and I'll just talk my way through it real fast. This is just an air vent. This is just obviously a loop to lift it up with the crane, and this is right here where it gets filled. Also, this is where you use a stick, whether it's something like this or a measuring stick, and you insert it in the hole and you check how many inches of oil there is. And so what's important to know here, you can see the mark right here where we just checked it. This one was basically about 7 or 8 inches from the top of the tank, so obviously we have about 36 inches or so in there. And a typical oil measuring stick will actually have gallons, because at a certain level, as the tank is smaller here at the bottom, it'll have less gallons, and as it gets up to the half, it gets more gallons per inch, and as it gets back to the top, it gets less gallons per inch. So that's ideal to use, but as a general rule of thumb, what I want to say is that as a homeowner or as a technician, be aware that when your oil tank goes down to about 6 inches, which is about something like this, somewhere in that area, there will be a lot of sediment at the bottom. Could be the tank that's corroding, could be just things falling in potentially, or moisture that gets into the tank and condensation because the sun comes out and when it's cold at night, and we go through different summer and winter seasons. Condensation happens in this tank, and that doesn't mix with the oil. Obviously, oil and water don't mix, but you can have that water get pulled into the pipe. And so what you see here at this other end, you can have a number of types of oil tanks, but this one is at the very bottom, and certain tanks will have that pipe actually go into the tank and then go up about 6 inches. And so when the oil gets down to about 6 inches, that's basically your empty level, because there's still oil below that, but it won't enter the pipe. Some of them will have a pipe a little bit higher and it actually goes down. There's different kinds out there, and so just be aware of which kind you're working with. Sometimes with a flashlight you can see inside what's happening, especially if it's empty, and sometimes you have a two line, so you have a supply line going to your furnace or oil boiler, and sometimes you have a return line so that you can have a two line pump that basically self primes, and that's the better kind, but older systems just have one, so priming the pump is a bit harder if you get air in the line. This one also has natural gravity going down into the basement, but some of them, especially if they are in the ground, don't have gravity, so it's harder for the pump to pull up. So having the pump primed is really important, and losing the prime is also a big deal. So be aware of those things. I know I'm kind of like talking my way through this real fast and trying to cover a lot of information, but I hope that's useful. And next we're going to go downstairs and talk a little bit about the furnace and some of the watch outs and some of the things to keep in mind there. The biggest thing I want to tell you is that when you have an oil furnace or oil boiler and you run out of fuel, that means that everything downhill from this tank might have gotten contaminated with all of those deposits, water, rust, any kind of debris, and it plugs up the oil filter and the oil nozzle. And sometimes you can have an oil filter right out here at the tank, but typically it's inside, and sometimes you have two, one here, one there. So just be aware that throughout a service, if you're a technician, you should check inside and outside, check oil levels, and just note that on your checklist so that we are aware. And if as a homeowner you ever run out of oil, that's another full service altogether. So new oil filter, new oil nozzle, new adjustments, new combustion testing, new air and fuel adjustments. It's basically a full service altogether, and sometimes it requires a lot of cleaning because that creates a lot of soot. As it plugs up and it gets dirty, the combustion is really nasty, so there's a lot of soot. So you're just basically looking for another full service back to back. And so if you can avoid that expense and the headache and the no heat emergency, do so by making sure you are never close to 6 inches. You're always at least a quarter or above. And I know sometimes this fuel is expensive and you can't have it topped off, but it's going to be more expensive to keep it always on low and have these extra expenses and nuisance service calls. All right, let's go in the basement and look at the furnace. Okay, so here at the furnace, just the basics of the furnace. This is the return duct, this is the filter or electronic air cleaner. There's the return going into the furnace. Down below here is the blower. This is the burner assembly. This is the heat exchanger back here. These are cleaning ports right here. These get removed, and with some brushes we clean inside and the vacuum. This right here is called the breech, where all the flue comes out of the heat exchanger, goes into this elbow and out into the chimney here. And then all the way out, you can have a masonry chimney, you can have a stainless steel chimney pipe, and this right here is a draft diverter. And so without going into too much detail and try not to make this video too long, I will try to brush over some of the basics here. And then if you guys have more questions or you want more detail on anything that we discuss here today, or even something that's not necessarily mentioned but you want to know about, feel free to ask me. You know, write a question down below, or any comments or additions you guys want to make to what I share. I don't pretend this is going to be all inclusive here. So this is your oil filter. So this is an RF1 oil filter. There's also another canister that's slightly bigger. That's an RF2. And I'm going to check in this box here, and I'll show you what these oil filters look like. So the RF1 oil filter, you know, help me open this. Just break up the box, the bag. There you go. So a couple of things that come in this are going to be the seal right here, and I could have obviously a video on how to replace this if you guys want. Just let me know if you're interested in that. This is the filter cartridge that catches all the impurities, but this is what gets plugged up with water and with impurities when the oil gets delivered or when it gets too low. And the other thing I forgot to mention outside was that when you have oil delivered to your house, don't run the furnace or the boiler, if you can, for 24 hours. Now I know in some situations you can't go that long, but if you can go 8 hours or at least an hour, allow everything to settle in the bottom of that tank. It'll make this oil filter last at least a year in most situations. This right here is going to be a seal that gets replaced every year, and it goes right here under this screw that holds everything together. And then this right here is where this seal right here goes. And then you have a bunch of nozzles that go inside of the drawer assembly up there, and those have to be replaced because they also get caught up. This is your transformer, this is your primary control, which is your reset button that you should never hit more than 3 times, because while it's trying to light, if there's oil in the tank and in the line, it's going to just atomize and just populate the entire heat exchanger with oil. And after we come out and we do service it, it's going to just make a big explosion, and never dangerous or life-threatening, but it's going to allow a lot of smoke in the house. It's going to be scary for a few moments, and then everybody survives, and then we learn from that. So never press this button more than 3 times if you're a technician, if you're a homeowner, because this will cause more headaches down the road. So this right here seems like it's loose, so it'll have to be tightened up. These are the thermostat wires, and then inside you have a CAD cell, and then you have a number of things going on. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right here. I will say that this is the port that you bleeded, just like brakes on your car. And then this is where you take your pressure, and there's other places you can hook up for the pressure testing. And then each one of these units will tell you the pressure it should operate at. And in this case, you can see here, it says that the firing range, you can have a nozzle as low as, let me try to point at it, as low as right here, 0.85 gallons per minute, all the way up to 1.65 gallons per minute. And then it tells you the type of head that this burner has, which is the cone and the end of the cone. And then this plate right here, I think it talks about the location of this plate, where it's going to sit. And then it tells you here to set it at 140 psi. That's the pump pressure. And I learned this from another more experienced technician years ago. It seems like there's a tendency for us to set them about 5 pounds above the setting, and I'm not really sure if that's right or wrong, but that's what I've been taught. You know, I would say following this is the best, but sometimes either the pump gets weaker or things happen that kind of gets you a cushion between the annual maintenance. And there are also homeowners who don't believe in annual maintenance, which you know, if you can buy them some more time, that's great. Although I don't advocate for that, because this is just like a diesel engine in a car that you can't skip your oil changes. Like, it's just too much risk with that. This other line here, it's the oil nozzle type. So there's different brands. So you can do like a 0.65 by 80B, which is the pattern of the oil spray. So the pattern could be like a ring of atomization going out. Could be a thicker ring or fully solid, where you just have a cone, you know, fully solid. And that's important to try to use the right nozzle. But if you don't have an A or a B, but you have a W is kind of the wild card for everything. So you can use one of those. And then the other thing that you should look at, besides the burner itself, you should look at the actual model and serial of the unit. And a lot of times here it tells you exactly what this unit, the heat exchanger, what it was set to do. So you sort of have to follow that. Here it says to use a 0.5 or a 0.75, and that's really important if you can follow it right here. Okay, so, and that's going to give you this BTU range, and that's what the furnace is rated for. Usually that's what the house needs, and it tells you what kind of oil nozzle to use, and it tells you what burner this furnace needs. So in most cases, just so you guys know, manufacturers, in this case, who's the manufacturer here? Armstrong Air, which is kind of like a Lennox. Armstrong Air manufactures the whole enclosure, the whole furnace, and then they buy a Beckett burner, or they can buy a Riello burner, or some of the other brands out there. Beckett seems to be the most common. So the technology and the idea is pretty much the same with all of these burners, with all of the manufacturers, and there are various models, but there are slight differences. And the best way to get used to it is to read the spec sheets and installation materials, the service materials that come with these burners, and that's going to give you the best information on how to deal with that specific burner. And fortunately, that's all available online nowadays. And then I'm not sure what happened here. I think homeowner said there was an issue last year, and they're still trying to recover some of the oil smells and issues like that. So today we just came back out to reservice the unit after oil was delivered. And so real quick, I'll just talk about the venting here. This is a port to measure the combustion of the air, and this is where you also measure the draft. Usually it should be minus 0.02 inches water column with a manometer or a combustion meter if it has a manometer built in. And you also have to do a smoke test, and this is a smoke pump. This is 2022, so maybe they have better technology, but this is what I'm used to. And on a scale of 1 to 10, that smoke test should come back at 1. If it's too yellow or too white, that means it's burning too lean, and if it's too black, it's going to burn too rich. So you want to have that fine spot, and then you check your draft, and then with this draft diverter you adjust this draft diverter and this weight on it so that you're constantly measuring minus 0.02 inches water column. But keep in mind, every time you adjust the smoke, every time you adjust the air, so this is like a big way to adjust the air by loosening this screw and moving these, you know, you can rotate this up and down to create a bigger gap here. And then there's a finer setting right here on the side where you can do the finer settings. And then you look at your CO2 and you look at your carbon monoxide, and you want to be within the ranges spec for that unit, and a lot of them are actually very universal, but not always. So anytime you make an adjustment, could be the air, could be the pressure. Usually you start with the pressure, make sure that's good. Then you do a smoke test, then you do the you do the fuel pressure, then you do your draft, then you do the smoke, then you adjust the air as necessary, and you just play with your air adjustment because your fuel pressure will stay constant. You'll play with your air adjustment, and then you'll play with your draft diverter back and forth until you find that sweet spot. It can take you 1 or 2 tries, it can take you 10 tries, and you just fine tune it during operation to make sure you find that perfect spot. So that's a lot of work and takes anywhere from 5 minutes to 20 minutes depending on how far off this is. And then the biggest thing that can influence your test is going to be your nozzle, because if it used to have let's just say a 0.75 gallon nozzle that burns at a certain rate, then you go back down to 0.65 because you see that on the plate. Now you just put it back into spec, but out of tune based on how the person before you did it. So all of these things affect each other. So anyway, without going into detail on how to service a unit, I wanted to kind of talk about the highlights of the things that cause frustrations for homeowners and how homeowners and technicians can avoid that, so we can avoid it. And in closing, I just want to point out some safety things. The biggest thing that you have to really watch out for is obviously a lot of the electrical components are just exposed here. So if you're a homeowner or a non-licensed technician, you should probably not attempt to do anything here. But you know, that's up to you. If you're the homeowner, you can do your own thing. However, keep in mind that this transformer here is up to 10,000 volts. So 10,000 volts is basically what you see on those really high line going, you know, across the county that you live in. So those are really high voltage lines. I think some of them could be 40,000, but anyway, really high voltage. Don't play with that because it'll zap you really hard. Not safe to play with that. Also, you can cause a lot of oil leaks and damage and issues, and you know how these screws are set and how, you know, these things here can leak. So there's a lot of little tricks that we know as technicians that we try to avoid causing callbacks and problems for the homeowners. And occasionally we get called out to service these units, and most of the work is just kind of fixing something that got started before we got there. So I just encourage you to kind of be cognizant of how far you want to take this. And then if you're a service technician, obviously you really have to know your stuff, get good training on this, and be really familiar with it. Lots of practice, a lot of reading on your own. Don't expect someone to teach you this stuff because you have to seek it out yourself sometimes. And that's pretty much it, but I'd be more than happy to share more knowledge on this. If you guys have specific questions, just type them below and I'll be more than happy to respond.